credentials to college. But my friend lives in it is German, Italian, in Austria.
It's no secret why they propped the door open. Is cleaner or chemicals in here? They do a science experiment maybe?
The previous teacher, when he leaves, he cleans all the desks.
Wow. I guess if you do that, it's just hard to get across campus.
It's so nice. There's a lot of desks.
Okay, we have some people getting a little too much enjoyment on fall break. We're not back yet. You're only supposed to have so much fun, at least fun that you can contain to 5 days.
So much fun and so much reading.
Oh, there you go. What's not fun about the reading? Of course. All right. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again for your patience. Just trying to zip across from the Clark building again. All right. So, hey, if you're online, let me know if you can't hear or if you can. Either way, just give me a confirmation there. All right, so a couple of announcements. No reading quiz this week. I'm a little backed up there, and I put up your discussion question. So discussion question number 2 is up and ready for you to respond to. Remember, on the syllabus it says it's due Sunday the 25th, but I changed that to November 1st. I was a little bit off on my timing when I wrote the syllabus, so discussion questions about race, we don't start talking about race until today, so I want to give you a little time of class discussion, at least the opportunity for that, before you were obligated to answer the question, respond to the question. So a little more laid back. Now we will have a reading quiz next week, and like I did this before when I skipped a week, I'll probably draw and put a couple of questions from the previous weeks on there too, so don't neglect the reading, but at least that gives you a little bit more lax time period to get it done. All right, and I'm in process, I think there's still one reading quiz I need to get done for you guys, but anyway, I'm processing getting all those caught up. I'm quite behind on the reading quizzes. I'll work on doing that this week. Okay, so we'll go over the discussion question together, maybe today, if not we'll go over it Thursday, so we'll be clear on what I'm after there. Don't forget about the extra credit. If you want to do that, that's available for you. It's already posted there on Canvas. And you just need, if you want to do the extra credit, you just need to have it in by the last week of class. December 10th is a Thursday. That's, I think, technically the last day of the semester. So just get it to me by December 10th, and it should be good. And that will go for 2 reading quiz grades. So whatever your 2 lowest reading quiz grades are, I'll put that in for that. And it's a movie review, and it's a really fast-paced, interesting, spellbinding. No, I wouldn't say that, but it's just pretty worthwhile movie. I think you'll find that most of the people that have watched it in the past for extra credit have really appreciated the movie and said it was definitely worth their time. Okay, so I said on Thursday that we were going to start talking about race today, which we are, but I also said that we're completely done with talking about beauty, and not quite. I just want to make this one last point because this is such a rich section here that I wanted to read with you. Sorry, I got rid of the title page. I want to show it to you. This is from a book, as you see, called The Soul's Upward Yearning. Robert Spitzer is the author. I don't think he is now, but at one time he was the president of Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. He's actually a Roman Catholic priest. But he has a lot of really good things to say. Very well thought out books, pretty philosophically in-depth, but definitely worth the time to read. So I want to read to you a passage about beauty from this, and this will be the last point that we make on a discussion of the nature of beauty and the experience of it. But this really brings to clear summation some principles and points that I've talked about before, so I didn't want to leave the section without going over this. All right, so here he's talking about justice, but the principle that he's referring to is that idea of the gradation of being, as we talked about when we talked about the arguments for the existence of God, supernatural versus naturalist view, that anytime we say something's good or better, we can't use those terms without some concept of the perfect, the straight line, crooked line. Right? Lights are really bothering me here. There we go. That's good. So, same thing, straight line, crooked line concept. So, here he talks about that as it relates to justice. Look at the first indention, indention and highlight. It says, we then ask what the source of our awareness of what perfect justice would be like, what it might be, what the source of that awareness might be, noting that it very probably did not come from the world around us, since all concrete manifestations of justice in the world are imperfect. This resonates directly with the passage from G.K. Chesterton, and I wanted to comment on this too. I need to reword the question or give a little more explanation of this passage. This is the passage when Chesterton is talking about the cat and mouse. Remember that? A lot of people took that to mean that, which makes sense if you don't, I think he indicates this in the passage too, but if you don't know Chesterton, maybe it'd be easier to make this mistake, but if you're not familiar with his writing. But a lot of people took that to mean that Chesterton is saying that, well, because you can't get ideas like victory or nobility from nature, okay, we look at the cat and mouse, and the cat conquers the mouse, and we say, oh, the cat was victorious. Or we look at a lion, and we say, oh, that lion is a noble animal. Well, Chesterton says, you don't get concepts like nobility and victory just from nature. As I was said in so many ways, that you can't get things like that from matter. So some people took that to mean Chesterton is saying, therefore, these are just opinions that we come up with on our own, and they're capricious or subjective. That's not what he's saying. He definitely believes that those concepts are real, that there is such a thing as nobility, there is such a thing as victory, but we don't get those concepts from the natural world. They come from another place. That's the kind of thing he's talking about here. If we have this idea of what true justice is, perfect justice, well, do we get that from something we observe in the natural world? Probably not. It's kind of like I was saying about, prison. And you look at the modern corrections world in the United States. Well, it's better than most places all over the world, but is it really justice in its fullest, complete, perfect sense? I wouldn't say that. So he says, where do we get this awareness from? All right, after the highlight. In view of this, we ask what the source of our innate awareness of perfect justice could be. We saw that justice is not only a unifier of individuals and groups, overcoming the misuse of strength, control, and power, but also a universal and unlimited unifier As such, it is capable of being a perfect unifier, a perfect unity. Okay? Now he goes down with that in mind, this idea of we have some sense that there is such a thing as perfect justice. It does exist, or at least it will exist somehow, somewhere, some way. Now he applies the same concept to beauty. Okay? Throughout history, great thinkers or artists have found themselves idolizing beauty. Our desire to be immersed in beauty and to possess and become beautiful is so powerful that it frequently becomes obsessive and all-consuming. Strangely, we can become intoxicated by something or someone beautiful and frustrated by the slightest imperfections in the next moment. We recognize imperfections and beauty not only in the world around us, but also in our own appearance. And when we recognize these imperfections, we try to improve upon them. Once in a great while, we think we have arrived at some consummate beauty. This might occur while looking at a scene of natural beauty, a sunset over the water, majestic green and brown mountains against a horizon of blue sky. But even there, despite our desire to elevate it to the quasi-divine, we get bored and strive for a different or an even more perfect manifestation of natural beauty. A little better sunset, another vantage point of the Alps. That's a little more perfect. And this is where I think I've said that a couple times in class, this phenomenon, say, with a painter, that if you have a woman who's a skilled painter, she's very passionate about it, she paints a portrait of a landscape or a person, and she's finished, but then she sits back and says, oh, you know what, if I could just shade this one area right here, then what? Then it would be perfect. So think of the concept of consummation. Now, usually we use that as it applies to, say, sexual relations. People will say, the marriage was never consummated. Okay, but that, in fact, is probably one of the best illustrations of it. But what's the concept? What does it mean for something to be consummated or to experience consummation?
Like ended,
What is it?
ended, completed.
Completed? Ended?
Reaching its potential.
Say it again.
Reaching its potential.
Reaching its full potential. Right. Zach?
Kind of like sealed, like this is an official kind of thing.
Right, absolutely. Seal is a good point because, like you said, end it, bring to that point of perfection. But the concept of consummation is more, it's deeper than just ending, because it's a concept of both ending and fulfilling. So consummation means that the nature of the desire is that, well, that's the nature of desire in general, right? But the nature of the particular desire is such that it has an object, that it's a desire for what? For something ultimate that will completely fulfill the desire, right? So, we desire in order, our desire moves us to a point where we will no longer desire. Or that's what we mean by satisfied or fulfilled, right? Okay, that being the case, how do you consummate the desire for beauty? How do you bring that to a fulfillment where you think, yes, I'm done, I'm ended, I'm fulfilled, I've reached the point of perfection? And that's what I'm saying. When the painter sits back and says, oh, if only I could shade this little area, then they're trying to get to that point of consummation. Right? Colton?
Just this concept just kind of reminds me of the story of Michelangelo, to the point of like he's sculpting, I think, the sculpture of Moses. And he is sculpting it, and it becomes so lifelike that at the very end he takes his hammer and smashes it on the knee, saying, stand, because it looks so lifelike, yet it is not a perfect representation because it is still not living.
Interesting. Yeah, I have not heard that story. That's really much to the point, yeah. Now, think about this. And he notes here, sometimes really passionate artists, now I know Zach's a passionate musician, so this would not apply to him, okay, but really passionate artists can be a little out of it, little eccentric, right? You think, man, they're really like, you wouldn't be that way, of course, right? Or maybe you would because you're so passionate. But he talks about, why is that the case? You know, like, if you take somebody that's really, really just deeply passionate about music, and they're committed, maybe they're really focused on a particular genre of music, and then you ride in the car with that person, and there's some cheesy pop song on the radio, and you think, oh, it's just Justin Bieber or whatever, and they're like, oh, I hate that, and they just go on about it. Why? What's going on there? You know, he talks about that here. He says at the bottom highlight, he says, when one reads the biographies of great artists, musicians, and poets, one senses the tragedy with which art is frequently imbued. All right, kind of teases us toward that point. Look at this middle highlight. Actually, let me read the whole paragraph. With this idea of consummation in mind. As with the other three transcendental desires, for perfect truth, perfect love, and perfect justice, or goodness, human beings seem to have an awareness of what is more beautiful. It incites, think about that now. We have an awareness of what is more beautiful. And even in the greatest experiences, in the most profound aesthetic experiences, there's still a sense in that experience that there's something beyond, that you have not reached the point of consummation, that this is whetting your appetite. So it says that human beings seem to have an awareness of what is more beautiful. It incites man to a more perfect ideal, but also has associated risk. It fuels the continuous personal striving for artistic, architectural, musical, and literary perfection. We do not passively desire to create. We passionately desire to create, to express in ever more beautiful forms the perfection of beauty that we seem to carry within our consciousness. So here's a suggestion as to why really passionate artists can be kind of crazy and live in this state of dissonance, this angst of, it's not quite right, and it's never quite right, and they listen to the song on the radio and think, oh, that's horrible, I hate that. And they're unsettled. So the premise that Spitzer, the author here, is working from is that there is a source, there is a wellspring of beauty. And this is interesting too. I don't know if this resonates with you, but and I've heard other people comment on this, and I've definitely experienced it myself. As I said before, try to put the word aside and just assess the experience and the experience in and of itself. There's something about the experience of beauty that makes you want to be united with it. The experience of beauty, of seeing something beautiful, is the experience of being drawn to. It's a magnetism, in other words. To be enamored, even, and it sounds weird because, again, it's that non-intellectual knowledge, right? You can't really articulate it, inarticulate knowledge. But even, I mean, obviously you can see how that would, let's say in romantic attraction, how the two people are drawn to each other physically. But even in, say, a landscape, you see a sunset on a mountain ridge and it's just magnificent, maybe over a lake or whatever it may be. There's something in the experience that moves us toward, that draws us in. There's a trajectory there. And something that leaves us not quite satisfied. Because we think, oh, that was so magnificent. And if I went up further on the ridge, then, well, one suggestion about why really passionate artists get in this state of dissonance is because they're trying to find that consummate reality in a place where it's not accessible. Okay? So this guy's Spitzer's working from the premise that source of beauty, where that point which we could be united with this ultimate source and say, yes, this is it. This is consummation. That this is in a transcendent realm. This is in a supernatural realm that we can't experience this side of physical death. All right, so he's working on that premise, from that premise. Here's an analogy. I said that the experience of beauty has an effect of drawing us toward its object, drawing us toward its source. It's like a smell. Okay, so I don't mean to offend anybody if you're vegetarian, but let's say a big rack of ribs on a grill, okay, and it's at a park or maybe a few blocks away from where you are, but one of these big smoker type things, and this huge rack of ribs, this barbecue, and it emits this smell. Okay, let's say you're 2 blocks down the road, but all of a sudden, faintly, but distinctly, you smell it, and you're really hungry, right? Well, the smell evokes a desire, which we call hunger. And that desire makes you, it's the nature of desire, it makes you want more of it. So that smell is drawing you toward its source, which is the big rack of ribs, right? So you begin to move and try to maybe walk down the block and get to where the smell is more intense, and you think, oh yeah, that's even better. Oh man, that smells so good. Oh wow. Well, there is a way to consummate that, okay? Because smelling, the consummation of smelling food is eating food, obviously, right? And the only thing that's really going to, this smell that evokes such a desire, you might even say such a discomfort because you think, oh, that's so good, I want, you kind of have this draw. Well, that can only be satisfied by eating the ribs. Okay, what he's suggesting here, or what I'm suggesting in light of what he says, is that maybe passionate artists and musicians and others of that mindset and skill set, maybe when they get really, really pathological, it's because what they're trying to do in reaching, they're trying to reach that consummate reality in a realm, namely the natural realm where it's not accessible, is a lot like somebody trying to satisfy the hunger that's evoked by the smell of the ribs by smelling more. And not believing there is such a thing as ribs. But there's this smell, and the person thinks, well, if I could just get to where the smell is more intense, then I would be satisfied. Well, of course not, because you'd never be satisfied until you actually, are united with, let's say, or you take into yourself the actual source of where that smell's coming from. Right? That's where the desire is moving you to. Well, if you deny the reality of that source and you think that in the smell alone you can be satisfied, well, that would drive somebody crazy, right? That would just leave you in a constant, just perpetual state of frustration because you're trying to, satisfy hunger through smelling something. I think that's along the lines of what he's getting at there, that we have to recognize that wellspring, that source, that place where we're consummated in this desire for beauty is in this transcendent realm. Yeah.
Is it all in the same line of thinking that, God would be the source of beauty, and so hopefully after death, becoming one with God would satisfy that innate desire?
Absolutely. That's his whole argument. Beauty, justice, love, that, you can talk in more detail about how you identify God through certain religious doctrines and certain religions, but in a fundamental philosophical sense, what we mean when we talk about God is the one, the power, the reality, which is, metaphorically speaking, the ribs on the grill, is the one emanating this desire. And the same thing is interesting. Plato said truth, beauty, and love, that those are all connected, right? And I said that in the experience of beauty, there's something about it that draws us in. It makes us want to be united with the object, with the beautiful thing. Same thing, and I guess this is most pronounced in eros love or romantic love. When you love somebody, you want to be with them. You want to be present with them. You want to be united with them. Which again, that's why we say marriages get consummated. That you want to come into this place of complete unity. I mean, that's the nature of love, and it's the nature of beauty. And it's interesting to think about that in light of Plato's insistence that these are different aspects of the same reality. Okay? And again, he mentions justice here too. That we want to see justice fulfilled. We want to see justice, done in a final sense where it's complete. Again, consummated. So. It's just a great passage. I wanted to make sure we took a few minutes in class and talked about that because this idea of beauty drawing us and the transcendent source of it, I think that's really just fascinating, and I think it resonates with experience a lot. At least in my experience, it does. And he does a great job of explaining it. So along with that, I just wanted to pique your interest maybe in the book, and this would be, in fact, I'll make a note of this. Last semester, somebody asked, and I'll send this out soon. I'll make a note, or rather, I'll send a list of books that I reference in class that you might want to read. Because I know everybody always reads the recommended reading list on the syllabus, right? Well, even if it's just a few of you, I'll email out soon, just a list of suggested books you might be interested in that I've referenced or that would go along with some of the things that we've addressed in class. All right. Truthfully this time, that's all I'm going to say on beauty. Anybody else have any comments or questions, comments, thoughts to share before we switch our direction here? All right. So, we're going to switch now. This is where on the syllabus our module changes. So up until this point in the semester, as I mentioned last week, most of what we talk about is, generally speaking, theoretical. We talk about certain ethical theories and we talk about certain philosophical premises and so forth and so on. So now we switch and we talk about things that, I don't want to say this as in the theoretical things we've talked about aren't related to the real world. That's what I've tried to emphasize, is that they're very much applied to our everyday decision making. But, so it's not like one's less real than the other or less pertinent. But here we get into the specifics of how those principles, let's say, apply and play out and or engage with situations and issues that we do see on the news, hear about on the news every day, and that we grapple with on a daily basis, here and now in our social environment. All right, so you might say the second part of the class, the second module is social ethics, social issues, issues of social justice and social concern, and things like that. As the slides suggest, our first topic is going to be pretty lighthearted, easygoing topic we can kind of breeze through, which I don't think weighs very heavily on many people, right?
Definitely not.
No, not at all. Especially not at this time in our history, right? So we're going to talk about race and racism. We'll move on later, and we'll talk about politics and economics. We'll talk about abortion and a little bit, not a whole lot, but a little bit about bioethics. So it's interesting, just given all that's going on in the culture, everything really that's the way that let's say public sentiment in many ways, which I know that's a really, really vague term, but a general attitude that's been pervasive throughout our American culture, really our Western culture, and you can see signs of it in Europe, that has really come about, I think that the launching point in many ways for the distinct atmosphere that we're in now started with the George Floyd incident in May. So it's interesting, I've taught the same content. This is my third time teaching this course, or third semester, teaching this course at UVU. And the content's basically the same. I may put in a couple extra pieces that we haven't looked at before, but 90% of what we're talking about is the same. But my I don't know, my attitude or sensitivity level is quite different than it has been in the past because of the wild environment that we find ourselves in the wake of, I say the beginning, and there's been several, of course, after that incidences that have stoked the fire of controversy, but beginning with the George Floyd incident. So that being the case, just because this is, I don't know, how do you describe it? Such a heightened sensitivity, such a tenuous, is tenuous the right word? Maybe not. I don't know. Just a generally sensitive topic, particularly within the last 6 months. I want to make a few comments that I wouldn't normally make as we start this topic, but I feel like it's necessary so that I'm not misunderstood, because given the level of emotional sensitivity to this, that's part of the problem, is that people are very quick to jump to conclusions in response to certain points, arguments, short phrases, and that kind of thing. So just a personal note, I grew up in Northwest Florida. My hometown is in Pensacola, Florida, which is right on the Alabama border. The joke in Florida is the further north you go, the more southern the people get. Because if you live in the Panhandle, it's like living in Alabama or Georgia. If you live in the southern part, it's like living in New Jersey or Cuba, because people either move from the north to come down to the peninsula, or they move up from the Caribbean. So anyway, I grew up there. Now let me make this really emphatic. What I am not saying is that people in the South generally are racist. All right, that is not true. Okay, that's not characteristic of Southern people. But I grew up there on the border. All of my family, both sides, mom and dad, are from Alabama. I went to college in Alabama, sadly at the university that was demoralized by BYU a few weeks ago. Anyway, went to college there. All my family's from there. Kind of feel like I grew up in Alabama as much as I did in Florida. And like I said, in that part, culturally speaking, it's pretty much the same. So when I grew up, up through high school, I'm not proud to say it, but I was a part of, in terms of family, like extended family and people that I was close to, adults, okay, I'm talking about adults when I was a child and, say, teenager. I was in circles of people that really were what you think of as the caricature of the old white Southern racist. In many ways, that was normal for me. Now, not that, I certainly, didn't think critically as I should. It was as a teenager, and I certainly, I'm sure said things that I, very much regretted later. As an adult, okay, when I left home and so forth, this is not something I embraced by any means. But I say it was normal because, growing up, this was just the way people talked. This is just what people said. This is how people saw the world. This is just the jokes they told. I grew up not only, with that kind of influence in my life from adults, but, I went to elementary and junior high. Probably was 50-50 black and white, maybe been more black, maybe been minority white at the elementary and junior high I went to. So quite different from Utah. Like I said, as I became an adult, as happens with a lot of people, the more distant I became from some of those circles in which I grew up, the more I came to see just how bad it was, where, when things are normal to you, you don't really get the weight of it. But, it was a regular thing for me to hear people make descriptions and comments and jokes and things like that would absolutely disgust you, and they should. Things that, were I to say it right here, I could be fired on the spot, and should be, right? Well, these were normal things for me as a kid. Again, with not all, certainly not all, but certain adults that I grew up around. Well, certainly I distanced myself from that in some pretty dramatic ways when I left home, but I've been married for 24 years now, and my wife and I, about 15 years ago, decided to adopt 2 children from Haiti. And which are great. Those are our twin daughters now, and they're just absolutely wonderful. But as you might imagine, given my backstory there were some people in my life with whom I was, up until that point, fairly close. Some people that did not accept that, to put it mildly. And it was really bad. It was really, a very difficult thing, because there's just this clash that, look, this is, in fact, I referenced this experience just briefly before, I think, in here, where I told you I was arguing with a person who really, was at odds with me on this point, and I said, listen, I just don't understand. I don't see how there's, and the person said, hey, we're Southerners, and this is what Southerners believe, right? So, with that being said, normally, like I said, I don't go into my personal history. That's kind of weird to talk about in class, but I feel compelled to make that point now because of the just the off-the-chart tumult, protest, unrest, all that's been going on since the George Floyd incident and building up to the election, and all the way in which racial divisions and racial concerns have been so pronounced in the past few months. I make that point about my personal background to avoid, like I said, anybody kind of putting me in the wrong camp. Okay, and I know that might sound like a really over-the-top thing to say to some people, but I would definitely say it confidently, not gladly, but confidently, that I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of racism more than a lot of black people. All right? I really do. And that's only because of the dynamics I just described, right? Not saying I'm a victim. Don't, it's not, people should feel sorry for me, by no means. But what I'm saying is, like most people, I have some things I think are really important in this debate. As we go along, as we talk about these points, I just don't want anybody to misperceive like where I'm going, or this is part of the nature of the problem. We constantly want to put each other in categories, and we constantly want to put each other, peg somebody as this or that, right? So understand, I am critical of a lot of the alleged the accusations of racism in our society. I think a lot of them are illegitimate, but don't take that to mean that I'm not sympathetic to the evil of racism, because I know it firsthand, and like I said, I know it better than a lot of people. So with that being said, let's talk about the issue, and I mentioned this on, I think, the first day of class. We spent a lot of time talking about this. Along with the content of what we read and what we're talking about in class, one of the things I most hope that you learn from this class, one of the most valuable things there is to gain from this class, is an increased ability to talk about, to discuss, to debate difficult issues, right? To really get in and engage with people, usually people who disagree with you, in a way that's mutually respectful, in a way that's productive, in a way that brings light and not just heat, right? In a way that you can walk away from the conversation with a little more insight that you had to begin with, and without demonizing or degrading the person who believes something different than you do. And learn how to do that in a real characteristic way where that becomes your MO, so that you don't live at the superficial level where you just talk about the weather and sports because you don't want to get into politics and religion, right? Well, that's an impoverished way to live. And hopefully, and hey, now's the time, rarely ever have we had such an opportunity to, to learn that, given our, what's going on in the society, right? Here's a real opportunity to get up and start talking about these difficult things and see if we can be adults, and not children as we deal with this, okay? So, be really careful about demonizing people. Be aware of that. Don't assume that because this person says this or has this bumper sticker or is from this place or whatever, or voted for this person, don't assume that tells you all that the person believes about race or anything else, okay? And like I said, disagree, but don't be disagreeable. Listen to people. Listen to what they have to say. Maybe they're totally wrong, but listen to them. And even if they are wrong, you still owe them a certain respect just because they're a human being. All right? None of us can say that we've never been wrong about anything. Okay? So listen to people. As best you can, give somebody the benefit of the doubt. All right? And just be open-minded in the best sense. Okay? All right. So with that being said, as we begin to talk about racism, beware of three things in particular. Number one, sentimentality. So what's a good definition for sentimentality? What's that mean? What's a quick, brief synopsis? Zach?
Appealing to the, is it the pathos of,
Right.
just saying things that will get people riled up.
All focused on the feelings. Yeah, the pathos, like you said, yeah, for
Yes,
sure.
feelings,
Is that what you're going to say, Lucy?
Yeah.
Yeah, feeling. So, you're exactly right. When we say that something has sentimental value, more in a positive note, it means that its value is only in its power to make us feel certain things. Okay, the value is not in the thing itself. So, one good example I often say is let's say if you have a sofa or an overstuffed chair in your home, and it's nasty. It's got stains on it, it's ripped, it's maybe one of the legs is broken, and somebody comes to your house and says, man, why do you keep that thing? That's just horrible. You need to get a new couch. And you say, well, yeah, it is pretty bad, but this is the couch where my grandmother used to sit when I was a child and rock me. And every time I look at that couch or sit on it, I have those great warm memories and those feelings of when Grandma would hold me close and rock me when I was a little child. Well, the couch has sentimental value, even though it has no value in and of itself. All right? Its value is sheerly in its ability to make you feel something. Okay? Typically, when people talk about sentimentality, they think of it in those terms and something that brings warm feelings or memories from the past. But the principle is that which, like I said, places the value on things solely on their ability to make us feel, or acting only in response to the way things make us feel. Think back to Plato's analogy of the two horses and the charioteer. Right? The horse of appetite and the horse of emotion. Sentimentality lets go of the reins on the horse of emotion and says, hey, you drive. Go wherever you want to go. All right, here's real life application. Okay, I forget what date it was. It was the end of May, their last maybe third or fourth week in May. Have this horrible incident in Minneapolis. Quite obviously corrupt or at least grossly negligent police officer arrests black man George Floyd. Struggle ensues. George Floyd winds up on the ground. I'm sure you've all seen the images. The cop has his knee on his neck and he's saying, I can't breathe. There are bystanders standing off the side, civilians, telling the cop, look, he says he can't breathe. He remains to keep pressure on the neck and he winds up passing away. All right. Now, I have never heard anybody, regardless of their political affiliation or any other belief that they have. I've never heard anybody say that that wasn't that bad, that was not unjust, that was not horrible. That's a consistent, perception of that, and that's the way it should be, because that was horrible. That officer was completely wrong. He should have been and was charged with misconduct, and I think he's charged with murder, and is currently awaiting trial. That's the way it should be, because that was a gross injustice and abuse of power. Okay, so because of the world in which we live, where an event can happen in Minneapolis and someone in Beijing can see it 30 minutes later through a screen, here's this image of, at least in that scenario, a helpless black man being abused by someone in power over him, namely a police officer with his knee on his neck. Well, that image on a screen, broadcast 100 million times, evokes certain emotions. I see this image. It very rightfully evokes in me emotions of anger, indignation, sadness, rage, frustration, and on and on. Well, that's what the image makes me feel. So let's say I'm in Salt Lake City, 1,500 miles away from where the incident happened. Well, what do with these emotions of indignation and rage and anger? I'm going downtown and telling them to defund the police in Salt Lake City. I'm going down and telling them, I've had enough, no more racial injustice. We want the Salt Lake City Police Department defunded. Do you think there's maybe a step or two missing in the process there? Can we know? And keep in mind, I'm not making an argument for or against, characteristic police brutality. I'm just asking the question, could anybody know from that one image of George Floyd that police brutality is just the MO? It's just a natural, normal, characteristic way of conducting business for police forces across the United States? How could you know that from that one image? How could you possibly know that? And yet, that's what happened. This happened, and then just days later, there's cop car burning in Salt Lake City and Miami and LA and Seattle and Portland and all over the nation because of sheer, unadulterated, unbridled sentimentality. I see this image, it makes me feel this way, here we go. No reason, no assessment, no questioning. Is this indicative? Is what we see with the corrupt police officer and George Floyd, is that really a picture of the way police normally work? And specifically normally work when it comes to black suspects? Is this just the MO? Is this just what it means to be law enforcement per se? Well, that's not really a question that was asked. It was just assumed. And it was assumed because of that rush of emotion. There were people in London. The Prime Minister of England lives at 10 Downing Street, and as you might imagine, just as we have Secret Service at the White House, they have law enforcement that protects 10 Downing Street there in London. There were a group of protesters that came by in London after the George Floyd incident that walked past the police. The police in England don't even carry guns. The street cops. They walked past the police at 10 Downing Street and yelled, "F the police," because of George Floyd. That is utterly senseless. That's just, like I said, that's just sheer emotional surge. It evokes images of slaves on the auction block, of black people hanging from tree branches in Mississippi from 80 years ago. All these pictures come to mind when you see this picture of George Floyd, and then you have voices that start to rage and tell you how bad. It's on. The flame is ignited, and that's it. But nobody really knows. Nobody has any sort of reasoned, thought out assessment of what the case really is. In fact, there's quite a few black conservatives that are activists against Black Lives Matter because of their research into the data. There's and I can't remember, his name is Roland, and I can't remember the last name. There's a Harvard professor who's black. And I wouldn't say that he's necessarily, I don't know if he's an activist of any kind, but he did a formal academic study, and I can bring on Thursday the details so we can look this up. He did a formal academic study on the rates of police, I think it was the use of fatal force police on black versus white suspects. And he said that the results of his research were some of the most surprising of his entire academic career, because what it determined essentially was that police are actually more reluctant to apply fatal force to a black suspect, which in many ways would make sense because that gets so much more attention and you know, I hate to say it that way, but puts the police in so much more jeopardy, not only in their profession but legally as well, because of the climate in which we live. So at least there's an argument there to be made, and it's not somebody who's just a kind of armchair, you know, researcher. This is a Harvard scholar, and again, one who's black as well. So you have to be careful, and this applies to, you know, every good important decision in life. You can't just let the reins go and tell the horse of emotion to go wherever he pleases. It's got to be checked with reason and fact. And the other thing, I'm actually getting ahead of myself. These are together, all right, so these are kind of different sides on the same coin, so to speak. That we have to be real careful about is generalizing and over-extrapolating. And this is where people's sentimentality, if you're given a sentimentality, it makes you very, very easily manipulated. Because if the currency by which you operate is all emotional, then whoever wants to is going to be able to, they're going to know, if they push this button, if that button evokes an emotion that's powerful enough, they're going to get you to go where they want you to go. Because that's how you roll. You go with the feelings, and if they can pull the feeling strings, that's where you go. Zach?
Yeah, I think this one right here is especially frustrating. Like, I consider myself, to be, left of center, perhaps, in my political ideology. But at the same time, I feel like both left and right sides are guilty of overgeneralizing. On the left, people will say, well, it's entirely like this, like every police officer is inherently racist or whatever. And then, to the far right, people will say that there is no problem in the way that things are running.
Right.
Whereas in reality, I believe that it's somewhere in the middle of that. There are good and bad people in every, situation. So I just think the black and white thinking it's so frustrating because the reality is so much more nuanced. So.
Amen. Absolutely. You are absolutely right. I don't know if you heard, I heard this on the radio this morning, and what is so sad about this is how just alien it is, but both of the Utah gubernatorial candidates, the Democrat and Republican, Chris, is it Peterson? Is it Democrat? I forget. I think that's his name. And Spencer Cox. They made a joint statement, and it's both of them talking in the same place, same time. Have you heard this?
I just watched it.
Yeah. I want to say it's incredible, but it should be normal, right? But it's so rare. But they basically just said, hey, we're both running for governor. We're opponents of each other. Look, we both have different views, different opinions on how things should be run, but we share the same goals of individual liberty and a peaceful society, a just, well-oiled, government to live under. And we're concerned with people's best interests. We just have different philosophies on how to achieve that. And we're both committed to the peaceful transfer of power, whoever wins. Something so simple, right? But like I said, it's so alien. And like I said, of course, reality is more nuanced than all, liberals or these lawless, immoral, and conservatives are these mindless, Trump flag-waving rednecks, right? Well, no. There's a lot of nuance in the middle, It's much more complicated than that. And this is, and I know this sounds maybe like a cheap shot, but if somebody just came into the room here and heard us discussing this, and we said, listen, it's not black and white all the time. Issues of moral significance are complex, and there's a lot of nuance that's needed to be taken into account. You can't just push everybody to one side because you disagree with them. Then probably somebody would say, oh, they must be talking about like children. Maybe they're teaching like junior hires how to think like adults. Well, no, we're trying to teach adults how to think like adults, right? We're trying to be adults thinking like adults. Because in our political discourse, in our social controversies, everything just seems to get reduced down to this childish, like middle school playground, tit for tat. And it's so much more complex than that. Just like you said, Zach, the nuance in the middle. Back there, you had your hand up? Right there? No? Okay. Yeah.
The problem, the most horrible problem is generating madness from madness.
Mm-hmm.
You just grow the problem.
Absolutely.
And when you grow the problem, you go to destruction. And that's the most horrible thing.
Absolutely. In my role outside teaching, I do some significant counseling. I do counseling and marriage counseling, and this is a central principle in marriage relationships. Okay, you have a husband and wife, and you see exactly the same thing in political discourse. You have a husband and wife, they're arguing about money, let's say, okay? So here's the issue. The issue is about money. That's what they're arguing about. Okay, well, they come to the issue and they begin to argue. Well, in the midst of the argument, one of them calls the other a name, or says, you're just like your mother, or whatever it is, right? Okay, just like you said, madness leads to madness. Well, now, that generates anger, and that's a particular insult. Well, now you have the money issue. Well, now you have the insult, okay? And now you've got two things to fight about.
Sad thing.
Yeah, and then they'll go back and forth arguing about the money and the insult, and then in the process of arguing about the insult, the other one will make an insult, and now you have, and then and it multiplies. Same things. I really, really am disturbed at how casually, thoughtlessly, and easily people throw out the term white supremacy. You know, white supremacy means something distinct. I mean, there are groups that are white supremacist groups, and that's a pretty serious thing. I mean, that has some criteria to be a white supremacist. But I hear it very often in discussions about, you know, those who don't, support Black Lives Matter or whatever, or those who vote for Trump, that it's this white supremacist agenda. I mean, it's hard to think of a word. I mean, that's just utterly ludicrous. I mean, white supremacists are people who basically are neo-Nazis, who genuinely believe that not just, I wouldn't even make the cut with a white supremacist, right? Because white supremacists believe in Aryanism, or the Aryan race is a superior master race, and you're going to have blonde hair and blue eyes to be at the top of the chain, and everybody else needs to be controlled and owned or eliminated, right? That's white supremacy, not somebody who thinks Trump has a good economic policy. That's not white supremacy, okay? So again, the insult comes in, and then that stems off the accusation of white supremacy, whatever you want to say. Here's another point about generalizing that, again, is dovetailed with sentimentality. You can't, or you shouldn't really, oppose or call into question somebody's personal experience. So, I mean, and let's say if somebody was in the classroom here who was 70 years old, they're black, and they were born and raised in Mississippi, and they tell a story about how painful a memory they have of seeing just egregious racial injustice in Mississippi when they were in 5th grade, and how much it still breaks their heart to think about the way people were degraded just because they were black and they were kept from going to school. Well, you can't respond. You shouldn't respond to that person and say, "No, you didn't. You're making that up," or "It wasn't as bad as you say." What? No, nobody has a right to pass judgment on another person's experience like that. But here's the problem: if sentimentality is the MO, then the sadness, the sympathy that you feel in response to that story is going to be the thing that drives all of your decision making, that forms your entire perspective, and then you're going to be prone to generalize and say, "Oh, that is so bad, the way people were treated in Mississippi in the 1950s. You know what? Let's go burn down the building in Portland." Wait a minute. That's what you call generalize. That's extrapolating from the personal to the institutional, right? And that does not work, right? Or wait, Colton, you had something to say?
Yeah, within generalizing as well, I think the nuances within certain things get lost, and certain terms get interchangeable, which shouldn't be interchangeable. Like, I think specifically within this, people throw white supremacy into white privilege, which are two distinct things, but often are thrown together. But in very many ways, they are very much not the same thing.
Right, right. That's a good example. It is really relevant. Those are, regardless of what you think about the two terms or the concepts, they're not the same. You know, whether you're for or against or for one against the other, you can't just conflate and say those are the same thing, right? Ryan?
I was going to go along a similar line. A couple of years back, I gave a speech on like the distortion of language. One of the examples I used was the word Nazi, because it was right after the Charlottesville event, and how the word had been used before throughout like parts of the Trump campaign, but it got to be so broadly misused that when there were actual people with swastikas and flags and tiki torches acting as neo-Nazis, it was underplayed to a certain degree.
Right.
And same thing with racism, with white supremacy, like when it's so broadly cast and blanketed over so many different like groups incorrectly, it devalues actual racism and actual white supremacy to the point where it can't even be properly addressed.
Right.
So if you label everybody that's to the right of center a white supremacist for supporting Donald Trump, then when you have actual white supremacists on the far right, you can't even take care of it. You can't accurately address that.
That's right. If we had an actual white supremacist in the class, okay, shaved head, swastika tattoos, the whole bit, and was longing for those days of, late 1930s Germany, and yet is ostracized, is completely, on the fringes of society because, most American people know that that's an evil thing, something we don't ever want to infiltrate our society. And then people start, just like Ryan is saying, people start saying anybody that votes for Trump is a neo-Nazi. Well, wait a minute, Ryan, you all know him to be a pretty decent guy, right? He's pretty straight up, trustworthy guy. And I remember a few weeks ago, he was wearing a face mask that said Trump 2020 on it. So maybe he's a white supremacist too. But now that might make you think badly of Ryan, but more so, it would make you think less badly of the actual white supremacist. And then the white supremacist would say, yeah, you can call me that if you want. I'm just like him. He's a decent guy. He's a trustworthy guy. So yeah, we're just like him. And kind of stand under that umbrella. But that's only possible with that manipulation of language, like you said. And particularly the manipulation of language because of its emotional power. Because if I say, somebody who thinks that Trump has good policies, that doesn't really move you, does it? I mean, does that really stoke you to move in any particular direction? Somebody who thinks Trump has some good policies? Well, what about white supremacists? Now that'll get your attention, right? That has that rhetorical, emotional power. And when you pay attention to the discourse on George Floyd and racism and all that goes on and what's been debated so much for the past 6 months, it essentially has turned into nothing but an exchange of rhetorical jabs and people trying to leverage whatever emotional power they can by commandeering certain words and using them in whatever way it's to their own gain, with no real concern for what's actually happening and what the words actually mean. Zach?
I don't want to make this, a debate over Trump, whatever, but a good example are Trump's tweets.
Mm-hmm.
Those are, they appeal to sentimentality completely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the time just using words like,
Bigly.
yeah, like words that will, garner a reaction from people. And it's the same with literally every politician, really.
But Trump's kind of up to scale something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's pretty.
Whether you agree with it or not on that topic, one thing I was talking about with my friend the other day is that's part of his campaign strategy is he'll just throw out tweets and see how many likes and retweets he gets,
Mhm.
and then add that to his campaign. It's like before he actually had Build the Wall as part of his platform,
Right.
he just threw out a tweet about it, and it got so many likes and retweets. He's like, yep, let's add that to the campaign list. So it's an exact use of sentimentality where he's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I just want to see what's going to get people the most riled up, and I'll add it to my political platform.
Yeah. Wow. That's such a quintessential politician thing to do. But you got to be careful. And I should put it on the slide. But when it comes to this point about generalizing, like I said, from the person's individual personal experience, we should feel sympathy. We should feel anger and disgust over what this individual has had to experience. And if it's in our power to try to work to remedy the things that caused that, we should do it. But we should never, ever, and this happens all the time, confuse the personal with the institutional, right? Or try specifically what happens is people try to correct personal mistakes at an institutional level, right? So, okay, let's say the person's here talking about growing up in Mississippi in the 1950s and this egregious injustice that they experienced and they saw maybe their even father or mother or sibling was just ridiculously degraded by these white racists. And it brings so much sympathy, and it's just such a heartbreaking thing to hear. And then at the end of it we say, that's awful. Let's go down to the Edmonds office right now and change the policies at UVU. Because I'm sick of this white racist America, right? Well, UVU is quite a different place than 1950s Mississippi. And I mean, yes, that makes us angry, and it should, and it evokes a lot of sympathy, and it should. But does that, from hearing this person's horrible story, at the personal level, does that mean that there's something wrong with the institution of UVU or a hospital or a city government or whatever it is? Well, no. And here's the thing. The problem that caused this person to suffer so much is a problem of evil and corruption in the hearts of the individuals who inflicted that suffering on him. You can go and change the policies at universities and hospitals and governments all day long, but you can't legislate morality. And making changes at the institutional level is not going to have the impact, and sometimes it has the opposite impact, on the personal level. Now, there's nuance, like Zach said. Don't get me wrong. If it's the case that you actually do have policies in an institution that work against minority groups or anybody, then those need to be dealt with. Those need to be changed, no question, whether it's the federal government or the government of the smallest town in the smallest state. Absolutely. But you can't just simply say, oh, this person's personal experience can't be denied. No, it can't. Therefore, we want to fight this and make it right. We're going to go off and change laws and start banging on this drum of inclusion and equality and equity and all. Well, it may not be the case that the institution has any problem with inclusion to begin with. And the thing that you're trying to fight on that, you're not going to remedy that at the institutional level. Colton?
I think it really comes down to, honestly, education, and also cultures within people and changing minds as opposed to changing institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's one of the main failures of Reconstruction after the Civil War, is that they just initially just tried forcing everybody to do the correct thing, but they didn't want to do that, to the point that they push back, and then things like the Jim Crow laws are made, and all these things, because you still have people living in a culture where they believe these things and they don't want to change.
Right.
And so really the issue is people's hearts and less of the institution, because they'll constantly fight for what they believe as opposed to the institution, which can only impede it so much.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, in this class, if I said, okay, from now on, every one of you is going to wear this color shirt to class because this color shirt expresses solidarity and sympathy with a certain group that you're not even sure what's going on with that group. But still, I say, this is enforced, you must do it. Well, what I'm after is, I feel so much compassion for this group, whoever they may be, that I want everybody to feel that same compassion and show solidarity to help lift them up. Well, that's a good desire, but it's actually going to work in the opposite direction. If I force that on you, say you will wear this color shirt every time you come to this class, it's going to create resentment, resistance. You're not going to have any more, in fact, you may have less compassion for this group that I'm talking about, right? Because it's forced, so just like you're saying, it can work in the opposite direction. And remember, this is the central question of the race debate, to whatever extent it's a controversy. The question is not, is there racism in America? Sadly, yes, there is. And that's a great tragedy. Hopefully not, but I think it is reality that there's always going to be racist individuals. And to whatever extent those individuals threaten people or even threaten to go and change the laws to implement their racist agenda into our institutions, our government, they need to be countered. They need to be dealt with for sure. But the question is not, are there individual people who are racist? Yes, of course, sadly that's true. The question is, do we have systemic or structural racism where there are racist policies hardwired into our university, our education system, into our economic system, into our political system? And I mean, so if you're not white, is it the case that it is, say if you take a white person, black person, growing up in the same, let's say, socioeconomic bracket, okay, parents have the same level of income, parents have the same level of education and so forth, just by virtue of their race alone, the whiteness and the blackness, when those two people get ready to go to college, is it really harder for the non-white person to get in? Right? That's the question of structural racism. Is it the case that if you're not white, you face a bigger challenge in voting for your leaders? Now, is it the case that if you're not white, it's a lot harder for you to earn as much income and advance up a corporate ladder than it would be a white person? That's the question of structural racism. That's what can be dealt with at the institutional level. But again, certain incidences that we see on screen of one corrupt cop doesn't tell you anything about the answer to those questions. I mean, you have to establish that through much different means on different grounds. So again, nuance, like Zach said, discernment, thinking it through, not being driven by emotions, asking yourself what's actually the case. And there's, anyway, so much stuff we could say about this. I will add this in though. Anyway, I think there's a Netflix documentary on this, which I'll admit I have not seen. But I read the argument made recently that utterly shocked me because it struck me, given maybe there's aspects of it that I don't understand, but it struck me as just unbelievably absurd. And that is that the 13th Amendment, which said basically that all American citizens should have equal rights unless they're felons or they're charged with criminal activity, guilty of, and then if they're incarcerated, they're no longer privileged to the rights that all other citizens are. Well, the argument that I read was that's a loophole to help people maintain slavery. And they do so through mass incarceration. That if we can, people who are incarcerated do not have full rights as citizens, which is true. And if essentially the argument is that's one way we'll continue racism and slavery, we'll arrest as many black people as we can and mass incarcerate, and then we can still keep them down and prevent them from having the rights of everybody else. I just thought, if, at least that's my argument to you, that if we're not, weary of sentimentality, the generalizing, that's where it can go. I mean, people honestly believe that there are police forces out there just trying to get as many black people as they can into prison so that somehow they can continue the tradition of their grandfathers to hold slaves. I mean, that is stunningly crazy, and for so many different ways. But like I said, it's a good example of how absurd things can get if people don't check themselves on this emotional type of decision making. Colton?
I'm in a history class right now, and I just went over a section actually that went over that kind of thing. And I think that definitely is, people do use the system to best their advantage to push whatever they personally feel. And according, at least to the history book that I was reading, that was done especially earlier, closer to Reconstruction during the Civil War.
Okay.
Or specifically for governmental projects, different things like that.
To basically use free labor to get government projects done?
Yes.
And I can see that. I mean, in the late 19th century, maybe that, and when it was instituted, maybe that well was the case. But to apply that to today, to say, I mean, inmates in a prison are a liability for. I mean, they have to spend huge amounts of money per. I mean, the state loses massive amount of money for all the people incarcerated. It's not. I mean, it's a drain to the state. It's not. in any way a prophet or anything like that. But that does make sense in the context of 140 years ago, yeah. All right, one more quick thing, and then we'll pick it back up on Thursday. We got a few minutes here, that clock's fast. I've got right at 5 minutes. False dichotomies and conflations. So think about this. What if I showed up to class on Thursday, just walked around campus, wearing a t-shirt, and all that had on it was an American flag? That's it. No words, nothing, just American flag. To a lot of people, that would make a statement. What would be the statement?
You're patriotic.
It'd be more to that to some people. I mean, and not given, I'm generalizing, it wouldn't be this way to everybody, but there's a lot of people, if you listen to political discourse, Zach,
Right, I mean, like, sometimes people will, I don't know, in my opinion, some people can take it a little bit too far, and then it becomes nationalism, you know what I mean?
right? Nationalism, yeah.
And it's complicated, but, yeah, I see what you mean.
Or I don't have a truck, but I was thinking about getting one someday. If I had a pickup, and I had an American flag waving from the back of it, what would that say to people? Ryan and Colton?
I was just going to say, people would associate you wearing the American flag with a political ideology. They say you're on the right wing, Republican.
Right. Your political ideology, nationalism, right-wing, Republican. Colton?
I was just going to say that it also represents you supporting the system as it kind of stands as far as I'm concerned as well. There are representations of people not respecting the flag or not supporting how the system stands. For instance, people taking a knee during the national anthem specifically towards the flag.
Right, absolutely. And this is what I mean by conflations there. That you're saying, first of all, the system is unjust. I mean, that's the assumption. That again, racism is structural. It's built in. I think, was it Beto O'Rourke, the political candidate? I think it was him that said it's in our very foundation, or it's in our DNA, or something like that, as Americans, that racism is hardwired.
It's not Barack Obama.
Was Obama say that? They said something similar, because I was thinking either Obama or O'Rourke, but the point was that it's in our very nature as Americans. So if the American flag means you're happy with that, given that that's the case, and you want it to stay that way, to maintain the status quo. But think about this. Now, I think that's a gross extrapolation, oversimplification to say that because we have this. In fact, I would say the people who are most patriotic would be the people who are most disgusted by slavery, because that's a mar on the history of the country that they love so much, right? That shows just how bad good countries can be. But yeah, this idea of you perceive that there's racial, let's say police brutality, okay? You perceive that there's racial injustice in certain police forces in certain cities, and therefore you disrespect the American flag? How's like America, broad stroke, all full stop? How's America as a nation, as a history, how's that tied to a corrupt cop? That's a massive conflation there, And I just found myself with the sports, the NFL stuff, with the kneeling of the anthem. I mean, if you appreciate being American, of course that's offensive. But in addition, I just thought this doesn't make sense. I don't see the logic. How's like America, broad stroke? Yeah.
Something I found really interesting with just the taking the knee. I was reading somewhere that when they first coming up with the idea of standing for the national anthem and things like that, George Washington had said that he didn't want anybody in the nation to kneel before their government, which is why we stand. And so
that's funny.
I know. So I found that interesting.
Kind of a little irony in the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, we will pick this up, and we're going to be talking about this through next week as well. So, all right, hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on Thursday. You see, I graded one of your reading quizzes. I'm working on the others right now.
No, I don't know, but I never received a quiz 5.
That's fine.
And then now I'm going to have 5 and 6.
I think the one I just graded was 3 or 4. But, okay, I'll make sure I send that to you.
Yeah, I never received the 5. And then you said you would send me the highlighted maps.
What, for which one?
All of them.
Oh, okay, so I didn't send one after.
It's easier for me to study after reading the whole thing, go back
Right.
to the highlighted.
So I sent you the one